There is a recurring pattern that has destroyed many pension systems throughout history, such as in Italy, Greece, and even Russia. At the beginning of the 21st century, many developed nations believed that their pension systems were stable structures protected by decades of economic growth and government guarantees. However, beneath that apparent stability, a silent process was unfolding, one that would reveal a recurring pattern in countries with very different histories and political realities. Italy, Greece, and Russia began to show the same structural weaknesses: rising debt, a rapidly aging population, declining productivity, persistent inflation, and public administrations unable to fulfill the promises made. These crises might seem isolated, but together they form a single predictable cycle. Retirement systems were built around an intergenerational pact. Today's workers finance today's retirees, expecting that future generations will do the same. That arrangement worked when the workforce was large. The economy grew fast enough to cover the gap between revenues and obligations, and when governments could mask imbalances with debt. But the foundations of that pact weakened. Public debt shifted from being a tool for development to a mechanism used to cover current spending, including pension obligations that could no longer be financed with existing tax revenues. The emerging pattern is clear: gradual deficits, rising debt, delayed reforms, and eventual deterioration. These systems survive as long as credit is available and the illusion of stability remains intact. But once debt reaches unsustainable levels and demographic trends reverse, the promise of retirement security starts to fracture. This is the moment when the line between sustainability and collapse becomes nearly invisible. The collapse of a pension system does not begin with public announcements or immediate cuts. It begins when the accounting no longer works. When contributions can no longer cover current payouts, the state turns to debt as a temporary substitute. Debt does not solve the problem, it only postpones the outcome. With each passing year, the gap widens while the structure ages and the contributor base shrinks. What appears to be a stable system is internally already saturated. Inflation is the second accelerating force. Even when pensions adjust nominally, their real value erodes steadily. Inflation becomes a hidden cut, devastating for those who rely on fixed incomes. The third driver is demographic decline. Fewer young workers and more people living longer lives. Finally, opaque administration and political use of pension funds complete the deterioration. When these elements converge, the system enters a phase from which it cannot return to equilibrium. Collapse is not sudden. It is the logical conclusion of a process that unfolded over decades. Italy became the first major example of how a pension system can deteriorate until reforms fundamentally alter the social contract. For decades, the country maintained one of the most generous pension models in Europe, relying on the belief that its considerable private wealth and long-standing culture of saving would offset any economic fluctuations. Yet that confidence concealed a deeper problem. The system was never a true accumulation fund, but rather a pay-as-you-go scheme dependent on a workforce that was shrinking rapidly. The 2011 reform exposed this fragility. Linking the retirement age to life expectancy was not an innovative administrative measure. It was a direct admission that the original structure had reached its limit. Public debt had surpassed 140% of GDP. Much of it used to cover current expenses and social obligations that tax revenues could no longer sustain. The inverted demographic pyramid intensified the strain. Fewer workers supported more retirees each year, forcing higher contributions and reduced future benefits. Italy also illustrated the economic cost of pension stagnation. A state directing an ever larger share of its resources toward retirement payments loses the ability to invest in productivity, innovation, and long-term growth. Over time, this dynamic created a vicious cycle: less investment, lower competitiveness, and deeper reliance on public debt to sustain the system. Italy thus became a living laboratory demonstrating that pension collapse is not sudden, but the accumulated result of decades of postponed decisions. While Italy showed gradual deterioration, Greece represented abrupt collapse. Before the 2010 crisis, the country allocated more than 10% of its GDP to pensions, an unsustainable figure for the size and productivity of its economy. Funding came primarily from debt, tolerated tax evasion, and a state apparatus that had promised benefits far beyond its real capacity. For years, this fragility remained hidden behind a facade of stability supported by external credit. When Greece lost access to international markets and entered bailout programs, the pension system became one of the first casualties. The cuts imposed were not modest adjustments, but deep reductions affecting current retirees and future beneficiaries alike. The population suddenly realized that the pension promise was not an unbreakable right, but an obligation dependent entirely on the state's solvency. Poor management aggravated the collapse. Pension funds had long been forced to purchase risky government debt with minimal returns. When that debt was restructured, a substantial portion of accumulated capital vanished. Greece revealed a fundamental principle of pension deterioration. When the state uses retirement savings to stabilize its own finances, the promise of security becomes a systemic risk. The crisis proved that pension collapse reaches far beyond economics. It destroys social cohesion, institutional trust, and the expectations of future generations. Russia presents a variant of pension deterioration shaped by temporary abundance and deep structural weakness. Unlike Mediterranean economies, the country long benefited from substantial revenues derived from oil and gas, creating the illusion of a financially secure pension system. Yet, this stability rested on fragile foundations, an unfavorable demographic profile, a poorly diversified economy, and persistent administrative opacity. Over time, the demographic imbalance became impossible to ignore. Declining birth rates, a shrinking workforce, and uneven life expectancy created a widening gap between contributors and beneficiaries. This imbalance placed constant pressure on a system already dependent on volatile revenue streams. When global energy prices fell or production slowed, the funding mechanism for pensions was exposed instantly. The state attempted to compensate through domestic debt and reserve funds, but neither measure addressed the structural deficiencies at the core of the system. The 2018 reform, which sharply increased the retirement age, marked a turning point. It was not an optional modernization, but an unavoidable response to the system's inability to meet its commitments. Public resistance was immediate, revealing the breadth of frustration and mistrust among citizens who understood that promised benefits no longer matched available resources. Corruption further accelerated the decline. Mismanagement, diversion of resources, and politicized control over pension funds weakened the system's capacity to accumulate long-term capital. Funds intended for future retirees were redirected toward short-term state priorities, eroding financial stability. Russia's experience confirms the global pattern. A pension system anchored in unstable revenues, obscure deficits, and declining demographics inevitably reaches a breaking point. Even a resource-rich nation cannot escape the consequences when governance falters and economic foundations fail to support long-term obligations. The United States appears outwardly stable, yet its pension dynamics mirror the early stages of the pattern observed in Italy, Greece, and Russia. The social security system relies on a pay-as-you-go structure dependent on balance between active workers and retirees. That balance has shifted dramatically. The largest generation in American history is retiring, birth rates continue falling, and workforce growth is insufficient to sustain rising obligations. As a result, the system increasingly depends on federal borrowing to bridge the gap between contributions and promised benefits. Official projections warn that dedicated Social Security trust funds will face significant shortfalls within the next decade. This does not imply immediate collapse, but it signals a structural imbalance that deepens with each fiscal year. Inflation has intensified the strain. Although benefits adjust through cost of living formulas, these adjustments frequently fail to match increases in essential expenses such as housing and healthcare. Real purchasing power declines, even when nominal payments rise. Individual retirement savings have also weakened. Years of low interest rates eroded returns on traditionally safe assets, forcing savers and pension funds alike to assume higher levels of risk. Political polarization further complicates the possibility of reform, delaying measures needed to stabilize long-term obligations. The United States now moves along the same trajectory as the countries previously examined. Its size may delay, the full impact. But structural pressures, demographic contraction, rising debt, inflation, and political inaction point toward a predictable and increasingly unavoidable outcome. When a pension system enters its final stages, the deterioration is no longer silent. It emerges through unmistakable signals that reveal the system is approaching a point of no return. The first and most decisive signal is the loss of public confidence. Individuals begin to doubt whether the system can fulfill the promises made to earlier generations. This mistrust affects both current and future contributors. Fewer people are willing to rely on the system, participation weakens, and early withdrawals or alternative financial strategies become more common. A pension model built on intergenerational trust cannot survive once that trust collapses. The second signal is monetary degradation. Inflation becomes the mechanism through which the state reduces real pension obligations without openly declaring cuts. Nominal payments may remain stable or even increase slightly, yet retirees find their purchasing power shrinking each year. Essential expenses rise faster than official adjustments, and the gap between nominal security and real vulnerability widens. Inflation becomes a subtle but powerful tool of fiscal survival, shifting the cost of systemic imbalance onto those least able to absorb it. The third signal is the fiscal capture of pension funds. What was designed as a collective savings pool for future retirees is increasingly repurposed to finance present-day government needs. This process may begin as an extraordinary measure, but gradually becomes routine as public finances deteriorate. The distinction between workers' savings and state budgets dissolves, and pension reserves turn into a silent form of deficit financing. Once this boundary disappears, the system's long-term viability is effectively compromised. The final stage is political crisis. As financial pressures intensify, governments are forced to propose reforms that are deeply unpopular. Higher retirement ages, lower benefits, or structural overhauls. Each option triggers public resistance. The system reaches a point where any solution is painful, and no solution is sufficient. By the time these reforms become unavoidable, the deterioration has progressed too far for a smooth transition. Collapse is no longer a distant scenario, but the natural conclusion of long-ignored structural imbalances. The comparison between Italy, Greece, Russia, and the United States reveals a pattern repeated with striking consistency. Excessive debt, rapid aging, persistent inflation, weakened savings, and administrative mismanagement converge to push pension systems toward unsustainable trajectories. This raises a fundamental question. Is collapse unavoidable, or is there still room to change course? History suggests that pension systems remain viable as long as they are supported by ample workforces, fiscal discipline, and robust economic growth. When these pillars erode simultaneously, the margin for correction becomes narrow. The United States still possesses economic power and institutional capacity, but the scale of its obligations and the political difficulty of enacting major reforms create significant barriers. Yet collapse is not predetermined. Some nations have managed to implement difficult but effective adjustments before reaching the tipping point. Long-term stability requires transparent reforms, strengthened savings mechanisms, and responsible fiscal management. These measures are challenging but represent the only path to avoiding a breakdown. The true danger lies not in inevitability, but in denial. Systems fail when societies act too late. Whether the United States chooses reform or continues postponing the cost determines whether the pattern concludes in collapse or transforms into a rare second chance. We are seeing history repeat itself. And this time, it could be the end of the cycle for the United States. Most people ignore the signs until it is too late. If you understand what's coming, you cannot stand by. Subscribe now and stay one step ahead before the collapse stops being a possibility and becomes reality. Don't wait for someone to tell you, because when everything falls, information will be your only defense.